The dust of Redemption Gap was a character in itself, a fine, bitter powder that coated every surface and settled in the lungs of every soul unfortunate enough to call the town home. It was the dust of failed crops and broken dreams, and on this day, it swirled with a particular malevolence around the auction platform. Elara stood at the edge of the sparse crowd, her black morning dress a stark silhouette against the bleach-boned sky. The wind tugged at the stray hairs escaping her severe bun, each strand a reminder of the unraveling of her own life since Thomas had passed. She felt the weight of 7 pairs of eyes, the other widows of the valley, standing near her. They were a silent sisterhood of loss, bound by shared grief and the encroaching poverty that threatened to swallow their consolidated homestead, a place the townsfolk had cruelly nicknamed Sorrow's End today. However, the auction wasn't for livestock or foreclosed property. It was for a man. His name was Jedodiah, a fact spat out by the auctioneer like a foul piece of tobacco. He stood on the block, not in chains, but bound by a far heavier shackle, debt. His ranch, once sprawling and proud, had withered under a relentless drought. His cattle had perished, his wells had run dry, and the final, most whispered failure was his line. He and his wife, God rest her soul, had never produced an heir. He was barren, they said. His land, his body, his future, all barren. Now, with his wife gone to fever and his debts called in by the bank, he was being sold into indenture to the highest bidder. Elara watched him, her heart a cold, hard knot in her chest. He was tall and broad-shouldered, but he stood with a stoop that spoke not of weakness, but of carrying an impossible load for too long. His face was a mask of grim endurance, his eyes fixed on the horizon as if the jeers and pitying glances of the crowd were nothing more than buzzing flies. The auctioneer extolled his virtues with cynical flair. Strong back. Knows cattle, knows the land. Won't be distracted by a wife or chasing children he'll never have. A few cruel chuckles rippled through the onlookers. Elara felt a surge of something hot and unfamiliar, not pity, but a profound, aching recognition. She saw in his rigid stillness the same brittle pride she used to shore up her own crumbling world each morning. The bidding began, low and insulting. He was a broken tool, a piece of used equipment. $3. $3.50. The price stalled, the humiliation hanging thick and suffocating in the air. Elara felt a gentle pressure on her arm. It was Martha, the oldest of the widows, her face a roadmap of hard-earned wisdom. No words were exchanged, but a current of understanding passed through their small group. They had pooled their meager resources for salt and flour, but the sight of this man, this monument to quiet suffering, sparked a different kind of need. It was an impulse, desperate and perhaps foolish. It was defiance. It was a refusal to let one more good thing be broken by this merciless land. Elara's gaze met Jedodiah's for a fleeting second. She saw not emptiness, but a deep, banked fire of will. She saw a man who had not yet surrendered, even as the world sold him for parts. The auctioneer, impatient, was about to close. Going once, going twice, her voice, when it came out, was steadier than she felt, a clear note cutting through the dusty air. $5. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Head swiveled. The auctioneer's eyes widened in disbelief, then narrowed in contempt. To be bought by a gaggle of destitute widows was perhaps the final insult. He looked from Elara to Jedodiah, a smirk playing on his lips. Sold. To the ladies of Sorrow's End. May he bring you better luck than he brought himself. The gavel fell with a crack that echoed the breaking of a man's last tie to his own name. Elara clutched the $5 silver in her palm, the metal cool and heavy, feeling as though she had just purchased not a man, but the weight of his entire world. The journey back to their homestead was a study in silence. Jedodiah walked behind their wagon, his stride long and measured, refusing the offer of a seat as if to do so would be an admission of defeat. Elara sat beside Martha, acutely aware of the man's presence behind them. She watched his shadow stretch and shorten as the sun began its descent, a silent, persistent spectre tethered to their fate. The other widows, practical Mary, nervous young Cora, stoic twins Agnes and Esther, and sharp-eyed Ruth, kept their own counsel, the creak of the wagon wheels and the plodding of the tired horse the only sounds. The landscape itself seemed to hold its breath. they passed skeletal trees clawing at the sky and fields of cracked earth that resembled aging skin. This was their inheritance, a hard, unforgiving land that took more than it gave. It was the land that had claimed their husbands through accident, illness, and exhaustion. Now, it was the land they had to defend, and this silent man was their last, most desperate tool. What had they done? The question screamed in Ilara's mind. They had spent their food money on a man deemed useless by the entire county. A man whose own formidable strength had not been enough to save his own home. She risked a glance back. Jedodiah's eyes were not on them, but on the land they were passing. He was reading it, she realized. His gaze took in the direction of the water runoff, the type of hardy brush that survived where grass could not, the subtle contours of the hills. He was not merely walking, he was assessing, learning. There was an intelligence in his observation that the townsfolk, in their haste to label him a failure, had missed entirely. He was a rancher. It was not just what he did, it was what he was, down to his bones. They arrived as twilight painted the bruised sky in shades of purple and orange. Sorrow's End was less a single ranch and more a patchwork of 7 struggling lives stitched together. 7 small cabins, a communal barn with a listing roof, and fences that sagged like tired shoulders. It was a place of immense labor and little reward, a testament to their collective refusal to be scattered to the winds. Jedodiah stopped at the edge of the property, his survey now slow and deliberate. He took in the drooping gate, the overgrown garden plot, the path to the well. He was cataloguing their weaknesses, the 100 small points of failure that could lead to a final collapse. Ilara slid down from the wagon, her legs stiff. She felt the need to say something, to establish the terms of this strange, unsettling arrangement. But the words caught in her throat. How did one address a man they had bought like a sack of grain? She walked towards him, stopping a few feet away. The dust settled around their boots. He finally turned his gaze from the failing ranch to her, and for the first time, she saw the full force of his exhaustion. It was deep in his eyes, a weariness that went beyond the physical. Yet, there was no resentment there. Only a profound, waiting stillness. "You can take the old foreman's cabin," she said, her voice quiet. "It's small, but dry." He gave a single, sharp nod. "The well," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. It's the first thing he hadn't asked. He had stated a fact. He had seen their most critical vulnerability in the span of a minute. Ilara nodded, a strange sense of relief washing over her. He was not a man who needed to be managed. He was a man who saw what needed to be done. As the other widows began to move about, preparing their sparse evening meal, Ilara remained, watching Jedodiah walk toward the well. He was not their property. He was their gamble. And as the first star pricked the darkening sky, she allowed herself a sliver of hope, fragile as a spider's thread, that it might just pay off. The next morning, Ilara rose before the sun, a habit ingrained by years of work. She expected to find Jedodiah waiting for instruction, but the world was already in motion. The rhythmic thud of an axe echoed in the crisp air. She followed the sound to the woodpile, where Jedodiah was methodically splitting logs with an economy of motion that was almost beautiful to watch. His coat was off despite the chill, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle. He had already assessed their supply and found it wanting. He worked without pause, as if the labor itself were a language he was fluent in, a way of speaking to the world that required no words. She left a tin mug of coffee on a nearby stump, and when she returned an hour later, the mug was empty and the woodpile was twice its original size. He had moved on to the well. He spent the entire morning there, not drawing water, but listening. He lowered buckets, studied the dampness of the rope, examined the stone lining with a tradesman's eye. The well was their lifeline, and it had been growing sluggish, the water tasting more of mud each week. It was their deepest fear, the one they never spoke aloud. Around midday, he came to the communal porch where Ilara was mending a harness. He stood silently until she looked up. "The main vein has shifted," he stated, his voice still gravelly. "The one you're drawing from now is drying up. It will collapse the shaft if you keep using it. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Ilara. He had just confirmed their unspoken nightmare. "Can it be fixed?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Fixed? No," he said, and her heart sank. "A new one needs to be dug. Deeper. Over there." He gestured with his chin toward a spot 50 yards away, a slight depression in the earth that looked no different from any other patch of dirt to her. "There's water there. Deep, but it's there." He spoke with absolute certainty. The widows gathered, drawn by the gravity of the conversation. They looked from Jedodiah's resolute face to the patch of barren ground. It seemed an impossible task, a labor of months for a team of men, let alone one. "We have no tools for that," Martha said, her voice heavy with practicality. "No blasting powder, don't need it," Jedodiah replied, his gaze unwavering. "Just a shovel." And time. He turned and walked back toward the barn, leaving them to absorb the audacity of his proclamation. He was not asking for permission. He was simply informing them of the work that lay ahead, the work he intended to do. For the rest of the day, he worked on reinforcing the barn's sagging roof, using salvaged wood and his own ingenuity. He moved with a relentless purpose that began to subtly alter the atmosphere of the homestead. For months, they had been patching, holding on, their work a desperate defense against decay. His work was different. It was foundational. It was building. That evening, as Ilara watched him from her cabin window, silhouetted against the dying light as he sharpened a shovel blade, she understood. He was not trying to earn his $5. He was trying to build a fortress against the failure that had consumed his own life, and in doing so, he might just save theirs. The digging of the well became the new rhythm of their lives. Each dawn began with the scrape of Jedodiah's shovel against the hard-packed earth, a sound that became as constant as the chirping of crickets at dusk. He worked through the searing heat of the day, his shirt soaked through, his face etched with a permanent mask of dust and sweat. The widows worked around him, a silent, orbiting system of support. They kept a bucket of fresh, cool water for him at the edge of the growing pit. They left him his meals, larger portions than they took for themselves, on a clean cloth. They said nothing, and he said nothing in return, but a new language was forming between them, a language of shared labor and mutual respect. Ilara found herself watching him more and more. She saw how he conserved his energy, his movements deliberate and powerful. She saw the intelligence in his hands as he shored up the sides of the deepening hole with timber from the collapsing sections of the old corral. He was not just a brute force, he was a craftsman, an engineer of the earth. One afternoon, a sudden dust storm blew in, a ferocious, blinding wall of grit that sent the women scrambling for their cabins. Ilara, securing a loose shutter, saw that Jedodiah had not stopped. He had simply tied a kerchief over his nose and mouth and continued to dig, his form a ghostly shape in the swirling ochre haze. It was a kind of stubbornness she understood, a refusal to be bowed by the cruelty of the elements. It was the same stubbornness that kept her and the other widows here. When the storm passed, leaving a fresh layer of grime on everything, she walked out to the well site. He was leaning on his shovel, catching his breath, his eyes red-rimmed. She held out a damp cloth. He hesitated for a moment, then took it, wiping the thickest of the dust from his face. "Thank you," he murmured, the words so soft she almost missed them. It was the first time he had offered such a sentiment. "You should have taken shelter," she said, her tone more gentle than she intended. He looked at the hole, which was now deeper than he was tall. "The storm is a good time to dig," he said. Softens the topsoil even in a tempest, he had seen an advantage. It was a way of thinking so far removed from her own reactive survival that she felt a sense of awe. He saw the world not just for what it was, but for what it could be, how it could be worked. A bond, unspoken and fragile, was growing between them, forged in the shared silence and the relentless rhythm of the work. It was not a bond of affection, not yet, but of something more elemental, a shared will to endure. Weeks turned into a month, and the hole in the earth deepened. Jedodiah had rigged a pulley system to haul up the buckets of dirt, and the widows often took turns manning it, their small contribution to the monumental task. The pile of excavated earth grew into a small mountain, a testament to his singular focus. He was leaner now, hardened by the labor, but the stoop of defeat was gone. He stood straighter, his purpose etched into his very posture. One evening, after the work was done, Ilara was tending to her small, struggling herb garden near his cabin when she noticed a flicker of light from his window. Curiosity got the better of her. She crept closer, peering through a small gap in the curtains. Jedodiah was sitting at a small, rickety table, a piece of scrap wood in one hand and a small knife in the other. By the light of a single candle, he was carving. His large, calloused hands, so powerful with a shovel, moved with an incredible delicacy. He was shaping the wood into the form of a bird, a swallow with its wings swept back in flight. His face, in the warm candlelight, was transformed. The grim mask of endurance was gone, replaced by an expression of intense, quiet concentration. It was a look of love. Ilara felt like an intruder, but she could not look away. She thought of the whispers in town, of his barrenness. They saw only what he could not produce. They had never seen this, the gentle, creative force within him, the part of him that could coax life and beauty from a dead piece of wood. It was then she understood that his infertility was not the core of his tragedy. His tragedy was the loss of his partner, his home, the life he had tried to build. The label was just the salt the world had rubbed in his wounds. She backed away silently, a lump in her throat. The man they had bought was not empty. He was filled with a quiet, powerful spirit that the world had simply failed to see. The next day, she left a small, smooth piece of willow wood beside his usual dinner plate. She never mentioned it, and neither did he. But a few days later, she saw a new carving on his windowsill, a tiny, perfect horse, standing beside the swallow. It was a silent acknowledgement, another sentence in their growing, wordless conversation. The trust between them was no longer just about his labor. It was about seeing the person he was beyond the labels the world had given him. The day the water came was a day of quiet miracle. Jedodiah had been in the hole since sunrise, and by late afternoon, the rhythmic scrape of his shovel had changed. It became a wet, sucking sound. He called up, his voice echoing from the depths. Ilara, it was the first time he had used her name. She ran to the edge of the pit, her heart pounding. The other widows followed, their faces a mixture of hope and trepidation. "Send down the bucket," he said. Slowly Cora and Mary worked the pulley, lowering the bucket into the darkness. They felt the rope go slack. After a moment, a tug. "Haul it up," Jedodiah called, his voice tight with anticipation. They pulled, the rope growing heavier with each turn of the crank. As the bucket emerged into the sunlight, it was dripping. It was filled to the brim not with mud, but with dark, clear water. A collective, breathless gasp went through the women. Martha dipped her fingers in it, bringing them to her lips. A slow smile spread across her face. "Sweet," she whispered. "It's sweet." Ilara knelt, looking down into the darkness where Jedodiah stood, ankle-deep in the reward of his labor. She could not see his face, but she could feel his triumph. They had water. Real, abundant, life-giving water. The news of the new well traveled, as all news did, on the wind. It was this news that brought Silas Croft to their gate. Croft was a man who had grown fat on the misfortunes of others. He owned the bank, half the businesses in Redemption Gap, and held the mortgages on more land than any one man could ride across in a day. He arrived in a polished black buggy, his bulk seeming to diminish the very sunlight. He surveyed their property with a dismissive sneer, his eyes lingering on the new mound of earth by the well. "Heard you ladies struck water," he said, his voice slick with false congeniality. He didn't wait for an invitation, stepping onto the porch as if he owned it. A lucky break. But luck doesn't patch a roof permanently or keep 7 households fed. Ilara stepped forward, positioning herself between Croft and the other widows. Jedodiah, alerted by the unfamiliar buggy, had emerged from the barn. He stood near the corner of the house, his arms crossed, a silent, formidable presence. Croft glanced at him. "Still got your $5 man, I see. A barren rancher for a barren patch of land." Poetic, the insult was meant to sting, but Jedodiah's expression did not flicker. "This land is not barren," Ilara said, her voice cold. And it is not for sale, Croft chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. Everything is for sale, Mrs. Miller. Your husband's debts didn't die with them. I hold the notes on this consolidated property. You've been scraping by, but this well makes the land valuable. Valuable to me. I'll give you $100. For all of it. More than fair to clear your debts and give you enough to move on. It was a pittance. An insult dressed up as charity. Our answer is no, Elara said, her resolve hardening. Croft's smile vanished. That's a foolish answer. This is a generous, one-time offer. I'd hate to have to foreclose. A piece of paper from a judge is all it takes. You have 1 month to accept. He turned, his gaze falling on Jedodiah one last time. Don't think your man there can protect you. He couldn't even protect his own with that parting shot. He climbed back into his buggy and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and dread in his wake. The threat settled over Sorrow's End like a winter fog. Croft's words had been a poison dart, aimed at the heart of their fragile security. The joy of the new well was instantly tainted by the knowledge that it had made them a target. That evening, the 7 widows gathered in Elara's cabin, the flickering lamplight casting long, dancing shadows on their worried faces. For the first time, the full weight of their vulnerability pressed down on them. $100, Cora whispered, her hands trembling. It's more money than we've seen in years. It's an insult, Ruth countered, her voice sharp. He wants to steal this land from under us, just like he's stolen from everyone else. The conversation devolved into a spiral of fear and uncertainty. They were 7 women against the most powerful man in the county. They had no legal recourse, no money for a lawyer. They had only their will, and it felt terrifyingly inadequate. Elara listened, her own fear a cold stone in her stomach. But as she looked at the faces of her friends, her sisters in loss, something else began to burn alongside the fear or anger. They had survived. They had held this place together with their bare hands and broken hearts. They had gambled on a broken man and, together, they had found life in the parched earth. She would not let Silas Croft take that from them. She stood up, and the room fell silent. We are not selling, she said, her voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even herself. This is our home. We fought for it. We will not hand it over for a handful of silver. She looked from face to face. We have something Croft doesn't understand. We have each other. And we have Jedodiah. A short while later, she found him by the new well, checking the sturdiness of the winch he'd built. The moon was high, bathing the yard in a ghostly light. He means to take this place, she said, foregoing any preamble. Jedodiah didn't turn around. He continued to test the rope, his movements methodical. I heard he thinks we are weak, she continued, standing beside him. He thinks you are a failure. Finally, he stopped. He turned to face her, his features carved by moonlight and shadow. His eyes, which had for so long held a universe of weariness, now held a different light. It was the cold, hard light of resolve. My wife, Sarah, he said, his voice low and even. She loved our land. Not for what it gave us, but for the work we put into it. She said the work was a kind of prayer. Croft. He doesn't understand that. He only understands taking. He looked from the well to the cabins, his gaze sweeping over the small homestead that had become his world. This is good land. You are good people. He paused, his eyes meeting hers. The silence between them was no longer awkward or empty, it was filled with a profound, shared understanding. He won't take it, Jedodiah said. It was not a boast or a threat. It was a promise. In that moment, the transaction was finally complete. The $5 had been paid back 100-fold. He was no longer their indentured servant. He was their defender. And she was no longer just a widow surviving. She was a leader, ready for a fight. They did not have to wait a month. Croft, accustomed to immediate capitulation, was enraged by their defiance. He returned a week later, not with legal papers, but with 3 grim-faced men on horseback, hired muscle from the saloon. They rode into the yard with an arrogant swagger, stopping short of the new well as if to lay claim to it. Ilara saw them coming and her blood ran cold, but she did not run. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from her hearth and walked out onto her porch. One by one, from their own cabins, the other widows emerged. Martha with a wood axe, Ruth with her late husband's hunting rifle, Cora with a cast-iron skillet held like a shield. They were armed with the tools of their domestic lives, transformed into weapons of defense. They formed a silent, determined line behind Ilara. Croft smirked from his saddle. Ladies, ladies. There's no need for this foolishness. My men are just here to inspect the property lines. If it was a lie, thin as smoke. One of his men dismounted and started towards the well, a length of heavy rope in his hand, clearly intending to foul it. Before he had taken 2 steps, Jedodiah was there. He seemed to materialize from the shadow of the barn, moving with a speed that was startling in a man his size. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply placed himself between the man and the well. He was a wall of muscle and immovable will. "This is private property," Jedodiah said, his voice a low growl that carried across the yard. The hired man, a swaggering bully used to intimidating shopkeepers and farmers, hesitated. He looked at Jedodiah's solid frame, at the absolute lack of fear in his eyes, and then back at Croft. "Get out of the way, farmhand," the man snarled, trying to regain his footing. Jedodiah didn't move. He didn't even blink. "I said, get out of the way," the man shouted, and lunged forward, shoving Jedodiah in the chest. It was like shoving a granite boulder. Jedodiah absorbed the impact without giving an inch. Then, with a swift, powerful motion, he seized the man's arm, twisted it behind his back, and propelled him forward. The man stumbled and fell face-first into the dust at Croft's horse's feet. The other 2 men reached for their holsters, but stopped when Ruth leveled her rifle, its long barrel glinting in the sun. "I'd advise against that," she said, her voice steady as a rock. Croft's face was a mask of fury and astonishment. He was being defied, openly, by a pack of widows and their $5 rancher. He looked at the 7 resolute women, at Jedodiah standing guard over their well, and saw not weakness, but a fortress he could not breach. It was Ilara who delivered the final blow. She stepped down from the porch, the iron poker held loosely in her hand, and walked to the center of the yard. She stopped before Croft's horse, her gaze locked on his. "You were wrong, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice clear and carrying. "This land is not barren. And neither are its people. Now leave. And do not come back." For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind. Croft's men looked to him, their bravado gone. Humiliation warred with rage on his face. Finally, with a curse spat into the dust, he wrenched his horse's reins and galloped away, his hired thugs scrambling to follow. They did not look back. In the aftermath of the confrontation, a profound quiet settled over Sorrow's End. The dust stirred up by Croft's hasty departure slowly returned to the earth. The widows lowered their makeshift weapons, the adrenaline ebbing away to leave a shaky, triumphant relief. They had faced down the vulture of the valley and won. They had stood their ground, and their ground had held. Ilara watched Jedodiah walk back to the well. He ran his hand over the wooden frame, a gesture of ownership, of protection. He had defended more than a hole in the ground, he had defended their home, their future. She walked over to him, the heavy poker forgotten in her hand. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows and bathing the homestead in a soft, golden light. It was a peaceful light, a forgiving light. "He won't be back," she said, a statement of fact. Jedodiah turned to her. The fierce, protective fire in his eyes had softened into something warmer, something deeper. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and she saw a reflection of her own journey in his gaze. She saw the resilience, the quiet strength, the scars that had been transformed into armor. "No," he agreed. "He won't. No ground declarations were necessary. No discussion of the future was needed." In the shared crucible of that afternoon, everything had been forged into place. He was no longer the man they had bought, and they were no longer just the women who had bought him. They were partners, bound by a pact of mutual salvation. Martha came over and placed a hand on Ilara's shoulder. "You were good, Ilara. You were strong," she smiled, a rare, full smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "We all were." They looked around at their home. The sagging fences, the listing barn, the 7 small cabins. It was not a grand place. It was a hard place. But it was theirs. And for the first time since their husbands had passed, it felt less like a refuge of sorrow and more like a bastion of hope. That evening, they shared a meal together, all 8 of them, around a bonfire. The flames danced, casting a warm glow on their faces, chasing away the last of the shadows. There was a quiet contentment in the air, the easy comfort of a family forged not by blood, but by shared hardship and a stubborn refusal to break. A year passed. The seasons turned, and sorrow's end turned with them. The spring brought rains that filled the new well to the brim, and the water, just as Jedodiah had promised, was sweet and clear. The vegetable garden, nurtured by that water and the widow's careful hands, flourished. The barn no longer listed, Jedodiah had braced it with new timbers, its roof solid against the sky. The fences were mended, standing straight and true. The homestead was still a place of hard work, but it was no longer a place of desperation. It was a place of life. Ilara stood on her porch, a cup of coffee warming her hands in the cool morning air. She watched Jedodiah down by the corral, working with a young colt they had bought with the profits from their surplus vegetables. He moved with a patient, gentle authority, his voice low and calming. He was teaching the horse to trust, not to fear. It was, she thought, what he did best. He had taught them all the same lesson. He had shown them that barren ground could yield life, that a broken spirit could be mended, that strength was not the absence of wounds, but the courage to grow around them. The whispers in town had not ceased, but their tone had changed. They no longer spoke of the barren rancher and the sad widows of Sorrow's End, they spoke of the homestead with a grudging respect. They spoke of the water, the thriving garden, the unbreachable unity of the 7 women and their formidable foreman. Ilara was no longer the timid woman who had hidden behind her mourning dress. She was the matriarch of their unconventional family, her voice steady, her hands capable. She had found a strength she never knew she possessed, not by erasing her grief, but by building a new life upon its foundation. Jedodiah finished with the colt and walked towards the house. He saw her on the porch and a small, quiet smile touched his lips. It was a smile she had come to know well, one that held a world of unspoken understanding. They had never spoken of love, or of a future beyond the next day's work. Their bond was not one of passionate declarations, but of shared sunrises, of calloused hands working side by side, of the deep, abiding peace of mutual respect. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "The colt is learning," he said. "He's a good one. You have a gift for that," she replied, her voice soft. He simply nodded, accepting the compliment as a simple truth. The $5 she had paid at that dusty auction felt like a lifetime ago. It had been the most important investment of her life. It was not the price of a man, but the cost of a chance. A chance at redemption, not from sin, but from despair. A chance to prove that from the most desolate of soils, with enough work and a little bit of faith, something beautiful and enduring could grow.